Hey there, we're talking about an issue that I've covered a lot in agriculture before about the need to reverse our commodity thinking to increase margins. That's the subject today, looking at revenue versus expense and how we can make more money. That's the topic on this edition of the Business of Agriculture. Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of the Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with Pattern Ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field. Then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture. I got my man Todd Thurman joining us today, a topic that he actually brought up, and I've spoken to you a number of times if you've seen me on stage, and I've also talked about it at least once on the Business of Agriculture podcast. We're going to take a different twist on it. Basically, Todd says, hey, why is it so much innovation in agriculture looks to pare down expense, looks to become more efficient? We've looked at this so much on saving money versus making money. And I'm like, well, that's a commodity mindset. And that's a term I've used for a long time to talk about we in production agriculture. And it's not a bad thing. It's frankly how we were born. It's how we were raised. We think about how to make more with less. Good for the environment, good for the bottom line. But eventually, we're going to run out of ways to scrimp. We're going to run out of ways to become more efficient. And we're going to have to figure out how we can make more money. Todd and I are talking about that very topic today because it's something he brought up about a week ago. And I said, let's cover that in a podcast. Todd, give me your background on this revelation, if you will.
I think, first of all, it probably starts with kind of defining what we mean when we say commodity mindset. I think in some ways it's kind of self-explanatory, but it's become so pervasive and it's such an ingrained part of our industry that I think maybe sometimes even people that have been in the industry a long time don't really think about it. So I think a definition of the commodity mindset is really that perspective that focuses on products and services as interchangeable and devoid of unique value or any kind of differentiation. And so it's really all based on price, quantity, and standardized features. Okay, that served a really important purpose in the distant past as we had an extreme food scarcity in the earlier part of history. And then we became much better at producing food, but about the time we became better at producing food, the population exploded. And so that continued that scarcity mindset, even though we got really good at producing food. And so what we were really focused on was trying to produce food at volume and define standards very loosely so that we could say, okay, corn is corn as long as it meets these basic standards. And so if you think about these descriptions we have of number 2 yellow corn and those types of things, those are very broad definitions.
A bushel container weighs 56 pounds. It's going to be these standards. And it became very tradable this way. It was very good then because the person that's buying it in California to feed dairy cows knows that they're getting a standardized product. So commodity doesn't mean low quality by any means. It means standardized. And it became then, when you're in commodity production, the way to make money, because you can't differentiate. My corn, as long as it's number 2 yellow corn, is not different from yours. And just like my coal, it's anthracite coal and yours is anthracite coal. And so there's no differentiating it. So then it becomes, how do I make money? Well, you and I both have talked about this. Once you have the commodity production process in place, the only way to increase profits is to produce more cheaply.
to produce them cheaply or to, grow. So produce more of it.
Bigger and cheaper.
Right. So it really drives that mindset around efficiency. And I, we mentioned before we started recording that, I certainly don't want to position this as efficiency is bad. That's it's great. It's really the reason we've gotten to where we're at, and we need to continue to focus on efficiency. I think what we're trying to say is that's not the only, we can't keep focusing on that almost exclusively. We've got to embrace the other side of that ledger. There's two fundamental ways to make more money. It's reduce your cost or increase your revenue. And we've been almost exclusively focused for the last 100 years on the cost side of the ledger. And by nature, that gets more and more difficult to do. As you take meat off of that bone, there's less and less meat to take off. And so I think we're at a point now where we need to shift and start to really understand better what can we do to enhance our revenue.
Todd, I'm going to go ahead and address, because I know that we have ag people right now who are listening that disagree with our position. They're going to say, wait a minute, Todd just said for 100 years, all we've done is focus on reducing costs. That's hardly true. Grandpa's John Deere 4020 didn't cost near as much as this $500,000 machine I got here. No, understand what we're saying is dollars per utility derived is really what we're talking about. So yes, are hogborns more expensive than they were in the 1950s? Well, hell yes. Todd's in the hog business all over the world. But they also produce more hogs more efficiently with better air, less water consumed, better handling of the manure, more efficient feed systems, et cetera. So when we talk about containing costs, we're talking about cost contained per pound produced, per gallon of milk made, per pound of pig walked out the building. That's what we're talking about, right? So to say that somehow it's less expensive to be in agriculture now, no. But on a dollars per unit produced, all we focused on is bigger and make more with less. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. So we are reducing our input costs relative to the output and increasing the volume of the product that we're selling. Those are the two primary ways that we've, made more money. So the swine industry is a perfect example. You go back and look in the 25 years or so that I've been in the industry, we've made most of our progress in two ways. We've produced heavier market hogs. So we've produced more pork, and then we've produced more pigs per litter. So we've been more efficient with those sows. So we can produce more pigs with fewer sows. And so those are the two ways that we've made the vast majority of our improvement in profitability, or that's how we've grown these businesses. And what we're talking about is adding, not taking away from either of those things, but adding a different dimension, because we have a different environment that we're operating in that's changing rapidly. And we have a new set of tools that we didn't have back in the day. And so even if we wanted to, we couldn't have managed the type of complexity that it would take to have differentiation.
By the way, also, and you're the hog expert, I'm not, but we also are making more pounds per feed conversion than we used to. Our genetics and our feed research, there's more pounds of pork being produced per pound of grain than there was. So there's another, again, it doesn't mean we spent less. We just spent less per hog produced because we focused on cost, right? Right.
And the improvements that we made there have been remarkable. And the industry is proud of that, and the industry should be proud of that. And we should continue to work on that. We're not talking about going to the other extreme and ignoring efficiency in favor of revenue enhancement. What we're talking about is adding a little more balance to the way we grow our business.
Yeah. So let's go about that. So let's go about tackling commodity mindset. And again, we were saying tackling because this is the one thing that's very important. No matter where you are in the business of agriculture, Todd's a consultant. I might hear in my speaking and producing, videos and all this. And I've worked for a lot of industries. Almost never in all my years have I sat down with someone, they said, we're going to come out with another line of product, and the entire focus on this is just to charge more for it. I mean, they kind of think that way, but then they almost defend it. I'm talking machinery. I'm talking meat. I'm talking everything, produce. We almost are terrified of charging more because what we always think is that the consumer thinks like us. Who would pay for that? Well, I had turkeys out here once, and I still lost my ass, but I had turkeys, and I charged twice what they were for at the store. And my people I knew came and bought them. Who's going to pay more for that? We always go with who's going to pay, who would pay that, who would pay that, because that's how we think. So the future, one of the reasons we're pushing this to tackle commodity mindset, and I want Todd to expand on this, we're going to have no choice. We're going to have no choice because there's less and less profitability. I just talked to my dairy farmer the other day. Milk's around $15 a hundredweight. His costs are between $19 and $20 per hundredweight. He can't efficiency himself down from $19.60, $19.40, $19.30, $19.40 per hundredweight produced. What are you going to do? Just stop feeding the cows? Well, then there's no milk. So the point is, we will have no choice but to figure out new ways to try and grow revenue. And I think it's through value-added products. I've been saying that for a long time, but you might have some other thoughts.
No, I think it's in value-added products as well. I think that's certainly part of it. I think in the very big picture, it's about shifting from a quantity mindset to a quality mindset. And then that leads you to the obvious question is, well, what do we mean by quality? And I think that's what we have to define. We have to define what quality means, not just to us, or actually not even at all to us, but to the consumer, and that what they're willing to pay. And as you were talking, I was reminded of a conversation I had recently with a pork producer, and they were talking about the Proposition 12 requirements, and his question was, well, are they willing to pay me an extra $5 a head if that's what it costs to comply? And I thought to myself when he said it, I mean, that's exactly how we've been responding to these things is, how does that affect my cost? Well, if you want me to do that, you're going to have to pay me $5 more because I'm going to have to put $5 more at risk. My $5, my production cost of production is going to go up $5.
Yeah.
But that's not really the way we ought to be looking at it. We ought to be looking at what is that consumer willing to pay?
Yeah.
And do we want to serve that market? It shouldn't really have it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with our cost. We shouldn't be saying, hey, you're going to have to pay $5 more because it's going to cost us $5 more. Well, we don't make any more money that way. We're just covering our additional cost. What we need to find out is, what is someone willing to pay $10 a head for that,
or 20 or 40
$5
or 20 or 40 or 50. Yeah. Nobody give the example you've given a number of times when we have our Business of Ag Success Group meetings, when you have explained the massively big hog farming operations across the world that you worked with, and you explain the concept to investors. Investors want to make money off of their money. What's their response?
Well, I bring foreign investors who are in primarily emerging markets where there's a lot of investment going on. There's a scarcity, there's a shortage, there's a lot of higher margins in those environments. And I bring them to the U.S. to show them how we raise pigs because they want to do it more efficiently. And one of the first things I do is I have to walk them through the economics of the U.S. industry, because a lot of what we do that looks confusing to them is really driven by those economics.
Right.
And every time I get the same result, they ask me, when I walk through those economics of the industry, they ask, why would anybody want to invest in this business? Right? Because the margins are really low and the return on investment is really low. And they are thinking to themselves, if that was what I was trying to accomplish, in my country, I would just be putting my money somewhere else. And I've never really had a particularly good answer for them, other than people tend to invest in what they know, right? And these people are among the best pork producers in the world. What else do they can invest their money in besides more pork production? So it's just almost like a reflexive move, but it doesn't really make a lot of financial sense in terms of a return on investment.
Right now, I have a little bit of money that I'm just sitting on, and it's in a money market fund, which I think I looked at the other day is, I think, paying 4.4% right now, because it's liquid, it's not tied up. And in general, you and I have talked about it. In general, you could look at putting several $1 million into livestock production, commodity mindset, commodity-based agricultural production, and you might end up in that 4 to 5% return range. And again, when you looked at it from a pure investor standpoint, if you're just producing a commodity and you're operating on 4.5% margins, why wouldn't then, if you were an investor, just take that money and put it into a money market account and make 4.5% and save yourself from all the headaches and the hassles and the stress?
Well, it's even worse than that because one of the big challenges that we have in production now is the amount of working capital that we have to have access to in order to make it through the volatility that we see in these modern markets. And so if you start thinking about, when you talk about pork production, you talk about that money that we've got to invest up front to either build or procure the facilities. Then we've got that significant amount of money that we have to have access to from an operating capacity, working capital capacity, in order to get through these downtimes when you might go many months losing $40 a head.
I like to pull up numbers. So if you're listening, you're not watching me, but in my office, I'm pulling back some numbers over here. And I like to point this out, that my most recent statement from Farm Credit, and I don't happen to use it, but 9.35% if I wanted to use some operating money. So if you're using 9.35% money to make 5% margins, probably not going to pencil out for you for the long haul now, is it? Anyway, so let's go about, again, we said we're going to tackle the commodity mindset thing. Here's where I think, because we're not bashing on production agriculture. Obviously, Todd and I are around it all the time. We're just saying the thinking has to change. So let's kind of set it up why this has to change. Well, first off, if interest rates continue higher, which they will, then operating on these little skinny margins is going to not be even profitable at all. And you say, well, the margins will move with the interest rates. Maybe they will. But either way, there's going to be less people willing to put money in there. So it'll force the consolidation, which has already happened. So we have less producers because when there's very, very little margins, all commodity, there's only one coal producer, right? There's only 5 oil producers. That's what we're talking about. But there's another big reason to consider this. Every innovation we come up with keeps talking about efficiencies with the idea that we need to make more, with the idea that we're going to run out. And if you have listened to anything that Todd Thurman and I have told you, we have given you the demographics. We have given you the data. We are not going to starve. We are not going to overpopulate. The reality is in the next 5 to 15 years, we're going to start seeing population decline. And at the same time, we still produce the shit out of commodities. We still produce as much corn, as much soybeans, as much wheat, as much pork, as much dairy as you could ever want. We will have no choice but to, in the future, think about getting more return, more value out of our products, because the need for commodity, the need for just raw calories will be met. So I want you to tell me what your thoughts are on that, Todd.
Yeah, so I think it's certainly the population shift, and we're already seeing that in certain markets around the world that are very important to us from an export standpoint. But soon, somewhere around mid-century, we're going to see that tip to where the whole global population is declining.
Yeah. Or sooner.
It definitely happens sooner. But what is definitely going to happen sooner, and nobody's really arguing with, is the fact that at the same time, our population is aging rapidly. And we know that as people age, they require less food, and they're even less likely to meet the requirements, right? So if we talk about young and middle-aged people, they tend to overconsume food beyond the recommendations, and that's part of the reason why we have the obesity epidemic and all these health problems. But when we get to older people, 60 plus, they tend to underconsume recommendations. And so when we set out to model what food demand is going to look like as these populations age, it's quite significant. And that's already a reality today. I mean, our friend Daryl Bricker shared with us a while back that in Japan, they sell more adult diapers than they do baby diapers. I mean, that piece in certain markets around the world is very much already arrived, and it's rapidly happening in several other markets in the world, including our own here domestically.
So the answer is, okay, we always hear about old people living on fixed incomes and how, they're poor and they can't eat. There's another thing that's really way inverse of that. If you are old, you are an empty nester, or if you've had only one kid versus 7, because this is where the demographics are going, we don't have big families anymore. Take the person that has one kid versus the family that had 7. Their economics are already better. By the time they're 30, they're not paying for 7 kids' shoes and clothing and food. They're paying for 1. So anyway, take that person out to age 60, which is not that far off. So, right, they're going to have the economic means. They're not going to be, assuming there's not something catastrophic to our economy, assuming there's not some, World War III, whatever. The person that's 60 years old right now that you and I are moving into not that long from now, Todd, is going to be financially able to eat better than a 60-year-old did 100 years ago. The 60-year-old 100 years ago was, certainly not as well off. So there's going to be this, and our ag people continue to wonder, oh, well, nobody will pay for that. We just saw it. You and I talked about meat. We talked about quality meat and how there's going to be, there need to be more of this branding of branded meat that has a different taste and whatever that thing should be. And what do we always say? Who's going to pay for that? And a bunch of the ag people, if you saw, I put it on social media, said, well, that's $1.50 pound more than I'm paying for. They went straight to the cost. They didn't talk about taste, flavor, what it feels, how it makes them feel as a consumer. And that's where we still think it's all about the price, and it's not.
Right. And I think where I'm encouraging the industry to kind of have a shift here is to distance ourselves or disconnect ourselves from the ideologies behind some of this. Right. So if you're talking about you want someone to pay $5 extra because whatever they want you to change in your production process is going to cost you $5, you're going to continue to push back on that because you don't want to have to spend the extra $5, even if you're going to be reimbursed for that, because we know the way that works. You get some of that cost up front, and you have to take the payment for that over time, and so there's always going to be a resistance there. But if, like what we talked about, if we think about this of, we're not going to argue with you about whether that's ideologically what needs to happen or whether that's what the way we should be raising our animals or producing our food or whatever, and it's just based on that. Hey, we'll do this. We'll meet that requirement that you have, and here's the price. And they'll either pay it or they won't. And depending on how many people will pay it, that'll determine the size of the market. When you start thinking about it that way, you're not saying, yes, we agree with you. The way we were doing it before is bad, and the way we're doing it now is good. We're simply saying there's a market of people out there that are willing to pay for that, and we're willing to provide that product with those specifications, and we're going to be transparent about how we create that trust with the consumer, and that's it. It's a value calculation. We're not making a value judgment. We're talking about a economic opportunity that we're seizing, and I think when you start thinking about it in that way, it becomes a lot more palatable to producers.
I want to, without offending anyone, I'm going to throw it out there that many people that work in agriculture struggle with the concept of segmentation. I'm going to get to that in a second, but before I do, I want to tell you about Truterra. Truterra is focused on supporting farmers at every stage of their sustainability journey to help them plan, make, and maintain regenerative management practices. Listen, regenerative is where it's going. Cover crops, using less, but also more importantly, environmental impact. We've already talked about using less. That's what we're talking about here. Now let's talk about also environmental impact. Let's talk about reducing your tillage. Let's talk about not letting your soil wash away into the streams or blow away in the wind. Let's talk about using some cover crops. Let's talk about some longer term, some forward thinking processes on your land. That's what Truterra is helping you do and get paid for. So basically, Truterra has money that come from other companies that want to make a commitment to a more sustainable agriculture, a more regenerative agriculture. So what you can do is find out if you can make money for changing a couple little practices on your farming operation. If you are not a farmer, you probably know someone who is. If you work in this business, you probably know lots of people who are. Tell them to go to TruterraAg.com, Truterra, Truterra, TruterraAg.com/enroll to find out how they can learn about this, maybe sign up, make some money, a little passive income for changing their practices and helping their path to regenerative ag. All right. Segmentation. Do you agree with what I just said? A lot of people in our industry struggle with the concept of segmentation. If you were, General Motors, great example. They used to have Chevrolet Chevette. They also had Cadillac Seville. They're the same manufacturer, but they understood there's a customer that can only buy a Chevrolet Chevette and a customer that also wants a Cadillac Coupe de Ville, Cadillac Seville, Cadillac, whatever you want to call the highest end Cadillac, Eldorado, for crying out loud. We, in general, unless you want to tell me I'm wrong here, Todd, I think in general, we always think that everybody's buying a Chevette.
Yeah. And I think that is, again, it's completely understandable if you understand the history and how that commodity mindset developed. We didn't have the capability of delivering 15 different types of corn to people that needed 15 different applications, right? We had a shortage of corn and we needed a system that was capable of delivering large volumes of corn to the people that needed it with basic standards of safety and quality standards, right? And just basic minimal standards. And so, now we have the ability to have more sophisticated supply chains that can keep those products segregated without giving away very much or even any efficiency. And so, it's understandable that we're kind of stuck in that because it was such a huge focus and a huge success for our industry. I mean, that commodification of these food products was a big reason why the agricultural revolution was successful. So, certainly.
I'd say that, by the way, it's gotten us where we are. And so the person that's listening says, all right, so what's your solution? So let's go ahead and go to where the solution is. Because right now they might be saying, what the hell else are we supposed to do? The big four grain handlers, of which used to be employed by Cargill, ABCD, the big four grain handlers, all they want is number 2 yellow corn. Okay, there's this new thing called, what is the type of soybean that's got, it's a new thing for human consumption, soybean or whatever. So there's a couple little strata within there. So I've got my ideas about where we will go. And I'm not saying you've got to be some crazy risk taker. I'm telling you, this is where the thing is going to go if you want to keep margin, if you want to add revenue versus just figure out how to be cheaper. You go with what you think, and I'll tell you where I think it's heading.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of opportunities, and they're around both the product itself and the way the product was produced.
That was what I was going to go. I was going to go with
product. Yeah, the product itself, that's something that's a little more palatable, I think, to producers in understanding that we're meeting a customer requirement. So if you think about well-defined meat quality, for example, as an attribute of the product. So when we're thinking about that from a quality standpoint, we're saying, okay, the consumer wants a better eating experience. If you can tell me what that means in a way that I can measure, and you're willing to pay a premium for that, I can figure out a way to deliver that product to you. So that's part of it. And then the other part that I think we struggle more with is the process in which that product is raised, whether we're talking about organic crops, whether we're talking about animal welfare friendly practices on the livestock side, whatever that is. I think there's a huge number of opportunities there, but those are a little more difficult for producers to wrap their minds around in terms of providing that product to consumers, because up until this point, to the degree that those products have been provided to consumers, it's mostly been provided by smaller niche production companies that are very ideologically based. And so you think of Nyman Ranch on the pork side. I mean, I certainly don't fault them for anything they've done. They've grown a really interesting business, and I think in a lot of ways they're a model for what the future is going to look like. But when we have,
by the way, for those that are listening and don't know what Todd's talking about, it's a branded product. Are they exclusive through Whole Foods? If not, they have a hell of a relationship with Whole Foods, and they're getting bigger margins. What Whole Foods is also, remember, and I want to bring that up real quickly while we're talking about Nyman Ranch. If you think this isn't real, or you think this is stupid, because I sat there, I've been in the beef meetings. God knows the beef people are so hard-headed. They sit there in their cowboy hats, and ain't nobody going to tell me how I'm going to raise them. And I've heard the pork people, and I've heard the corn, dairy. I've heard them all. No, tell me how to do this. Okay, nobody's telling you how to do it. But just imagine, and this is where I would like our people, imagine you were, and I've compared commodity production to making asphalt shingles. Let's say you kept making asphalt shingles just like Owens Corning does. And all of a sudden, there's a big push to go away from asphalt shingles. Now they're bad for the environment. It turns out those asphalt shingles have a huge negative impact on our carbon footprint. You know what? Turns out they're not even in style. Turns out all my friends said, if you have asphalt shingles in your house, you're out of style and your house is ugly. Well, then You could be Owens Corning and say, ain't nobody going to tell me how to make shingles. By God, I'm going to make asphalt shingles because that's what I know how to do. And I make good asphalt shingles. And the market goes away from you. Now imagine it's corn, pork, dairy, soybeans, vegetables, whatever. And the market goes away from you like that. And you're saying, well, nobody's going to tell me what to do. Good. Nobody told Owens Corning how to make asphalt shingles. But you know what? Sure as hell, they would have responded. And that's where I think we must have our reversal of thinking and realize that sometimes you see these tea leaves and you realize it's time to get in front of it. The one I'm going with is traceability. And that's where you were heading there, Todd. You've seen it on the livestock side. I've seen producers get up in arms about it. Again, I think the beef people are the worst. I've seen them be the most resistant. It tends to be on the hog side, very integrated, vertically integrated. So it's more easily done if all of a sudden your integrator is doing the sourcing or the source verified. Is that one of the ways that we'll see more margin, or does that end up going away because nobody cares about source verification anymore?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. And I think it's actually just a part of a broader issue of how do we create trust between suppliers and consumers. So one of the things that we saw recently, Tyson made an announcement that they're making a change to their antibiotic labeling. And so I don't want to go too far into that because that's a rabbit hole we could definitely go down. But if you go and read the comments on those posts on social media, one of the things that comes out pretty quickly is there's a segment of the population that they don't care what Tyson says or does. They're not going to believe them. Right. They don't have that basic amount of trust. And so they don't care what's on the label. They're not going to buy anything from Tyson. And of course, I'm using Tyson as a stand-in.
Yeah, the point is there's a
corporate ag or whatever.
Let's call it 10 to 15% of the population in the United States, in North America, because we're affluent. They will go to a Whole Foods or to a farmer's market or to the butcher down the shop, but they will never be a customer of Tyson, Pilgrim's Pride, name the five bigs here, JBS, whatever it should be, just because they will not trust factory food. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I think that's mostly true. I think if those people fell on hard times and got to the point where they couldn't afford it, I think you'd be surprised how willing they would be to be flexible with their values. But yeah, that's getting back to that point where I was talking about Niman Ranch is that is a company that has aligned its values with those consumers. And I'm not sure how replicable that is at scale. So you've got a situation where what's frustrating when from the pork industry, when we look at Niman Ranch, certainly they've been very successful, but their press release from the Prop 12 news looked almost exactly like the Humane Society of the U.S., which is an extremist activist group that wants to put animal agriculture out of business. And so, I think we have to try to, and this is going to be an enormous challenge. And I know I'm kind of stepping into something that's a much bigger issue than probably the scope of what we've talked about here today. But I think we've got to separate those ideological positions from the product themselves, and at some point get to a point where we can say, look, I don't care what it is. If you're willing to pay the price that I've established, I'm willing to provide that product for you under those specifications.
Yeah, I'm also call it values-based marketing. And while we're recording this, by the way, here in July, it's important to point out Ben & Jerry's just stepped in a pile of it. Bud Light, obviously 2 or 3 months ago, stepped in a pile of it. Kohl's, Target, I can go on. These companies that are doing it from a hardcore political stance. You could make the case, good God, don't ever go there. But what if the case is we want to support this type of production? And that's really what might end up happening. Of course, we've seen that also. Kroger said we're only going to sell cage-free eggs by the year 2025. Well, is that really going to happen now? Who knows? Because, the egg-free production ramped up to where we weren't even getting a premium for it. But here's one where I'm going to go, a couple things. What if it's not – right now the producer feels small, even if they're big producers, and they feel like the best way they can do this is to go through a program or whatever. They feel like they're out here jumping through the hoops and doing the hopscotch that McDonald's tells them to do or the state of California tells them to do, Todd. Most producers don't really want to become marketers. They don't want to create their own brand, right? It's a lot of work, and then they're taking on more risk. But what if it's some of this other thing about, and that's one thing, by the way, you can create your own brand. You can go direct to consumer more easily now than you ever could in the last 100 years. But what about the environmental angle on it? The environmental impact quotient and some of these things, is that going to come to ag where it's the next evolution of organic? It's the next evolution of branded beef. It's the next evolution of, yeah, we don't care about whether it's organic or Angus, but here's my environmental impact quotient. When you eat food from this source, it's better for the environment. I think that's where we're going to see some value add, but I'm not sure how soon it comes or what the margin booster will be.
Well, I think this dialogue, I think you're exactly right. I think that's possibly the biggest one. And it gets really interesting, as we've talked about in the past. Sometimes these different values contradict one another, and that gets pretty complicated as well. So we start looking at organic, and we start realizing organic production might be more negatively impactful on the environment than conventional production. Then we start to get a really complicated, confusing type situation. But again, that's another rabbit hole that we don't need to necessarily go down here. But I think what you're saying about meeting that need, I think, is important. But I think the way we go about meeting that need is equally important. And so if you think about this dialogue that we've had in the past of, okay, well, this is what the consumer demands, and so we decide to go ahead and meet that requirement, and then and maybe we get a little bit of extra money, maybe we don't. But over time, it becomes commodified anyway, right? It becomes table stakes. It becomes the consumer's base expectations. And so then whatever it is the next time, and then we feel like we're constantly trying to hit a moving target. What Nyman Ranch has done.
By the way, real quick, before about Nyman Ranch, and I know your mom always gets mad when I interrupt you, but I want to make sure that the person that's listening, remember, the person that's listening to this might have this thought also. You don't fault the American production agricultural system for feeling like it's always a moving goalpost, because it kind of has been. Okay, if you'll just switch over to whatever, name it, cage-free chicken. Well, that became commoditized, as you pointed out. And all of a sudden, there's not a huge premium now for cage-free eggs. I mean, there's a premium, but it's not enough that it's like, oh, damn, I'm sure glad we went and did all that work. It just was, like you said, table stakes. Now you have to do that. There's been a number of things you can think of. Across the barn for me are veal barns. And Jewel Osco, the retail stores out of the Chicago metro, said, we're only going to buy your veal if it's not tethered, and then it's group housing, and then so it's like they keep changing. Eventually, is it the veal producer going to say, "Son of a bitch, do I have to come out here and read lullabies to these veal calves to meet the next thing?" Because everything else that I went and did, you gave me a 10-cent premium on it, and now I don't even get that 10-cent premium. So you can understand the reluctance, or shall I say, skepticism from agriculture for these kinds of things.
Yeah, and 100%. And I personally have experienced that frustration and have a ton of sympathy for everybody else that has as well. But I really think it's about shifting that mindset, and then it becomes more about how do you go out and get in front of this issue. Right. And that's essentially what Nyman Ranch did. They said, look, let's take all of these what seem to be crazy requirements, right? And we're going to meet or exceed all of those requirements for animal welfare. We're going to get way out in front of the issue. And then we're so far ahead of everybody else that whatever that next turn is, but we're doing that in a way, we're getting a significant enough premium that we can jump out there and stay ahead of this issue no matter where it goes. And so on the environment, I think there's an enormous opportunity for a big producer even to jump out there and say, okay, what does that look like right now, given all the discussions we've had? What does that look like to come out and say, we are the environmentally friendly pork producers or the environmentally friendly cucumber producers or whatever it is? What does it take to get out there to be able to sell a significant premium and say, this is what we're offering to you, a complete package of the most environmentally friendly pork production or cucumber production in the U.S., and this is what we charge. And people go out there and pay for it. And the size of that market is determined by how many people are willing to go out and pay $7 for a cucumber instead of $1 or whatever that is.
Yeah. Well, by the way, it requires a bit of marketing, which, and I'm not talking about selling contracts of soybeans on the Chicago Board of Trade. I'm talking about marketing, as in getting out and selling and marketing, and that's something that a lot of us in production agriculture struggle with. We think, hey, man, we produce this stuff. You ought to come buy it. And then the other part of it is it takes a certain amount of risk. Nyman Ranch seems like they're genius now, and then the scoffer, the skeptic, can walk through Whole Foods and pick it up and lament that some dum-dum from the suburbs is paying this for it. Well, they didn't at first. Nyman Ranch produced the product and the story before they ever sold the damn product, right? So there was some risk there that I think there's some resistance on. Here's the thing. Let's get back to the kind of the wrap up on all this. I believe that we're going to see more branded products. You spoke about it before we hit record. I've talked about this before. In my hands, I have a generic can of beer that in the 1970s and early 80s, when we had 18% interest rates and double-digit inflation, not too dissimilar than what we're dealing with now, poor people in places like where I'm from in northern Indiana couldn't drink branded beer, so they switched over to cans like this that were store brand or just no brand beer, the rise of generics. And you're saying, well, why didn't that stick around? Because when it comes to branding, some of us, like I'm holding the vintage Coors can right here, identify with a brand. That's mountainous. It's on Yellowstone now. You're a cowboy. Plus, it tastes good. It tastes like America. 150 years they've been making Coors, my favorite. But what I'm saying is we are still in many ways in agriculture producing this generic can that just says beer on it. And there is so much opportunity for increased margins if you look at any other products and how you can say, all right, my brand does this. My brand, and Bruce Turkell, my marketing buddy that writes books, says good brands make you feel good. Great brands make you feel good about yourself. And basically, we don't quite see as much of that yet. Nyman Ranch capitalized on that, Todd. That's what their thing is, making you feel good. You bought the cheeseburger and it made you feel good about yourself. All you did was buy a damn cheeseburger and pay 40% more for the cheeseburger, a pound of burger at Whole Foods. It made you feel good about yourself.
Yep. And I think that's really where we need to get to. And that can be done. You get feedback from these big companies that say, well, that can't be scaled up. Well, sure it can. I mean, Coca-Cola is one of the biggest companies in the world. Yeah. Right. And they're in what could have been a commodity business. Right. They've created a brand that people identify with, whether that's for their values or, like you say, the way it makes them feel or, whatever it is, they've identified with that brand and they'll go out and prefer Coke over Pepsi or whatever it is. So, I think we're going to have to get to that point. And we have the ability to do that today. We just don't have those structures in place to really embrace that. And so I think we need to be looking at some of these other industries that have just sort of, decommodified and look at what that looks like.
God, I can understand where the producer out here in Iowa thinks, yeah, this is going to be hard for me to do. But it's not necessarily. My buddy with Extreme Ag, Kelly Garrett, has a direct-to-consumer branded beef business. He does not go about competing on price. He goes about competing on, first off, the cut size, the quality. It's not commoditized. It's not coming from national beef. He's got all this. It can happen at the farm level. And I want to throw another thing at you. And this is where I think we talked about breaking the commodity mindset. It's going to become that we have to. This isn't something like we're sitting here just pontificating and, oh, what the hell did Todd and Damian know? Todd's a consultant. He doesn't actually even grows pigs. Damian had a hobby beef operation. What the hell does he know? Well, I know this. I know the demographics. I know where this whole thing is going. And I also know what the margins are right now. Remember, I work for ag groups all the time. And I know that these numbers don't work. I know that right now, in many years, what was it, just 2 years ago? Roughly 1/3 of all the income that came to the Farm Belt was from direct government payments. So if you want to tell me that there's not room or a justification for increasing margins when 1/3 of your revenue is from government payments, tells me that you do have a revenue problem, folks. You do have an actual net revenue problem. That's where I want to go with this. Todd, anything on that? Would you say once about 4 weeks ago, would you say manure versus pork? Give me that one.
Yeah, it's clearly not sustainable long term. And then when you add in the demographic shifts that we're going to be experiencing, it becomes completely untenable, right? And so, yeah, I think the pork industry, and obviously that's where my background is, but I also think it happens to be a really good example for good reasons and bad reasons, but a really good example of what we're talking about here. And if we look back over the past 20 years or so, the average margin per head is about $2.50. So not only is that, probably sounds small to people that aren't familiar with the industry, it is a small margin.
$2.50 is a margin on a fat hog. And you're saying, oh, well, is that like, do they sell them for $8? In case you're not in the business of agriculture, no, that's $2.50 of margin on something that sells for about $200.
A couple $100.
Yeah.
Right. Of course, obviously that varies, but the average margin over the last 20 years is about $2.50, and the average value per head in the manure that those pigs produced was over $2.50. It was about $2.67, and so not a direct comparison, because obviously you have to have the pigs to get the manure. You can't decide to quit the pig business and keep the manure. So that's that. But I think it illustrates what we're talking about here, is that these margins are super low, and we've got some really old hog buildings that we can't replace because it just doesn't make any sense to build a new one. So that's an uninvestable industry. Right. So if you're just out there selling commodity pork, being competitive, it just does not make sense to invest a lot of money in expanding your operation, or even in many cases replacing 30-year-old facilities that weren't designed to last more than 15. And so I think we have a real sustainability problem, even without considering the fact that we've got unfavorable demographic shifts abroad and here at home that are going to be putting increasing pressure on that. So certainly when you layer in those issues, it's not sustainable, I don't think.
Well, I'll throw another thing about commodity mindset, which again is nothing wrong. We talked about it, the reason we have it, but versus consumer brands. And I know that's different, but there eventually is going to be not as much difference. And we're probably going to get to where I think we've got room for small brands. We've got room more than we ever did. Right now, the SKUs at the grocery store, there's more different variation of products at a average grocery store than there have ever been, with the exception of Aldi's, of course, because their whole thing is having almost no SKUs. So where else am I going to go with this? Over my shoulder, if you happen to be watching this on Acres TV or on my YouTube channel, you might see that I put the Do Business Better book there to cover up my file cabinet. I talk in there about being a promoter. And I'm going to talk about Coca-Cola that Todd just referenced. Coca-Cola spends on average 11% of their gross revenue worldwide on marketing and promotion. And so in agriculture, we can't even imagine. We talk to small business people and they're like, oh yeah, I spend about 2% of what I make on marketing and promotion. I'm like, what'd you do? You have a poor website and you print some business cards. Coca-Cola is one of the most recognizable, if not the most recognizable brand on the planet. You can be driving through a third world country in Africa and see a Coca-Cola sign. My point is, we are so far from that. Like we can't even imagine spending 1 or 2% of our revenue on marketing. And you know what? Let's think about what else they do. We still are right here telling everybody how cheap their stuff is. Hey, yep, your food's really cheap in America. Hey, we make lots of it. You know what? American farmer produces enough to feed 173 people. We tell them how cheap it is. We tell them how much we make, meaning quantity. And we also sometimes like to tell them that they should thank us. They should thank a farmer. Does Coca-Cola ever tell you that you deserve to give them gratitude? In fact, you need to thank them. Nope. Does Coca-Cola ever tell you how much Coca-Cola they make? Nope. Does Coca-Cola ever tell you how many people they provide Coca-Cola for? Nope. You see where I'm going with this? When we begin to reverse our thinking, or shall I say, evolve our thinking, we'll have to start thinking like why these consumer brands do what they do and make tremendously more margin. So I guess you can give me the outlook on that there, Todd. Is it ever going to happen?
Yeah, I think it has to happen, and it'll be a transition, and it'll be a slow transition, and that marketing will look different probably than it does for Coca-Cola, because that industry is different than most of the other industries we're talking about. But yes, and in terms of capturing the essence of what you're describing there, I think it definitely is going to change. And it's going to have to change, and that is going to be financed to some degree by those higher margins for these premium products that we're going to be selling, where now even the terminology we use makes it hard to even have these discussions, right? Because I talk about niche or niche production. First of all, that's a word that nobody knows how to pronounce correctly, but second of all, it implies small, right? And so it doesn't have to be small, right?
No, it doesn't have to be small. By the way, I like to call it niche, because I like to say niche can make you rich. The other thing is, do the big four on grain or in feed? Let's just go with those, are grain and meat. The big four: Archer Daniels, Midland, Bunge, Cargill, Dreyfus. Or the big four in meat: Tyson, Cargill, JBS, help me out here, Smithfield. Do they learn how to be a niche? Do they learn how to get into value add? Did they learn how to charge 70% more for a different type of product, or is it going to come from outside? I've got my prediction. What's yours?
I think it'll be a combination of both. And I'm not sure what that mix actually looks like, but I do think that you're going to end up at some point in the future where today we've got in meat, for example, maybe 10% maybe is significantly differentiated, and the rest of the 90% is commodity. Yeah. And I think we're going to be looking more like at 70% differentiated and 30% commodity, and a lot of that will be exported to developing countries. I think that's what it looks like. I think you're talking about a complete reversal of what the industry looks like today. Now, I'm not suggesting that's going to happen overnight. It's going to happen over decades. But if you're talking about such a massive shift like this, making a change like that over the matter of a couple of decades is a massive shift.
I won't leave it there. I think we are going to have the shift. We've told you, my friend Todd and I have told you, the reasons we're going to have it is because of demographics, because of lowering of demand. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but trust me, this whole feed the world thing is going to go away in another decade, and we're going to have to change how we think. Making more and then figuring out a way to do it just a little bit more efficiently, that's cool. Good. Be efficient. We like that. Good for the environment. Good environmental story. But that's not going to pad your margins. You're going to get used to working on less and less and less until all of a sudden there's no less to work on. Eventually you got to charge more for your products. Being branded and looking at the future. And it doesn't mean at the farm level necessarily, although I do see more and more collaborations where farmers can do this. And I will see a return of the co-op system. Todd, I've thought about that where, and we're seeing a little bit of that. Like, we produce this type of beef, grass-fed from Montana, processed local, whatever that thing is. I can see that happening more. But the one thing I would also tell you, since we talked about our example of Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola also doesn't do? They'll tell you what's in it. If they did, you wouldn't buy the shit. They don't say it's loaded with sugar. It'll probably give you diabetes. It's got some citric acid. It's got some stuff that's really hard on your stomach. Basically this stuff's not good for you. Instead, they say, I'd like to buy the world a Coke and teach them how to sing. And everybody, by the way, it's an old commercial if you're not familiar, from about the 1970s. The point is, they make you feel good. They say, if you buy this, it's a reflection on you. So that's where marketing, I think, eventually goes. All right. His name's Todd Thurman. My name is Damian Mason. He's a smart dude. He's all over LinkedIn. If they want to find you, how do they find you?
You can go to, actually I have a new website if you want to check that out. It's toddthurman.me, and there's probably way more information on there than you've ever wanted to know about me. My contact information is there. And then
what's it called?
Toddthurman.me.
Toddthurman.me. And then your new company name is Swine Innovation?
Swine Insights International. The website is swineinsights.com.
Also, he's all over LinkedIn. If you want to hear more from him and from me, the Business of Ag Success Group costs $99 a month, and we meet every other Friday. You'll have other smart ag professionals to network with. We bring in guest presenters and talk about cool stuff. So we're talking about the future of growing margins. That's really what we're talking about. And trust me, this future is not that far away where you can't skimp anymore. You can't cut back anymore. It's not going to be about efficiencies. It's going to be about growing revenues. I find that an interesting subject that all of us can learn from. Thanks for being here, Todd.
Thanks for having me.
As usual, tell your mother I said hello.
Will do.
She favors him, by the way, dear listener. Anyway, till next time, I'm Damian Mason, and this is The Business of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for being here. This episode of The Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Pattern Ag. You've heard me talk about Pattern Ag because I think it's a pretty cool concept. New technology that allows you to predict the problems you're going to have and therefore treat them before those problems cost you money. What kind of problems am I talking about? Pests and disease. Things like cordon rootworm, sudden death syndrome, cyst nematode, and a whole bunch of other bad things that happen out there in the field that can cost you money. Guess what? Pattern Ag will let you find out ahead of time if the disease or the pest pressure is there, and therefore you're treating it before it costs you any money. What a great concept. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to learn more about their product, their technology, how it can make you money, save you yield, and also where you can find a rep that can come out there and do the work for you. Pattern.ag.